My neighbor invited my husband to a men-only night. What I wasn't told involved panties. When my neighbor invited my husband to a men-only night, I didn't think twice. It sounded harmless. Just drinks, laughter, and time away. My husband didn't say much when he got home, and I didn't ask. What I didn't know was that the secrecy wasn't about privacy. It was about something else entirely. A detail so strange and specific that once I noticed it, everything unraveled. I didn't confront him. I watched. I listened. I noticed what changed. His habits, his excuses, the way he avoided simple questions. That quiet observation revealed more than any argument ever could. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't scandal that shocked me. It was how long he thought I would never see it. If this story helps you pay attention to what changes in the silence, please leave a like and subscribe. There are deceptions that announce themselves with obvious lies and suspicious behavior. And there are deceptions that hide in plain sight, concealed within activities that seem innocent and normal until you look more closely at what's actually happening. My husband's involvement in what was supposedly a harmless men's night with our neighbor turned out to be the second kind, a situation that appeared benign on the surface, but that concealed activities and dynamics I would never have imagined or approved of if I'd known the truth. The discovery came not through dramatic revelation, but through small observations that accumulated over months, details that seemed strange until I understood what they meant, patterns that revealed themselves only when I stopped accepting surface explanations and started paying attention to what was actually changing in my husband's behavior. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 35 years old. I've been married to my husband Kyle for 8 years, together for 10 total, a relationship I'd believed was honest and transparent, built on trust and open communication. The events I'm about to describe began about 9 months ago when our neighbor Richard started hosting what he called men's nights at his house, gatherings that were supposed to be just casual socializing among neighborhood men, but that turned out to involve activities none of the wives knew about, and that revealed patterns of deception and questionable judgment I'd never expected from my husband. Kyle and I had moved into our current neighborhood about 3 years ago, a quiet suburban street where most houses had young families or professional couples like us. We'd gotten to know our neighbors casually, waving hello, brief conversations about yard work or the weather, the kind of surface-level friendliness that's typical in suburban neighborhoods. Our next-door neighbor Richard was single, a man in his early 40s who worked in finance and seemed friendly if somewhat private. He'd occasionally invite Kyle over for drinks or to watch sports, and I'd thought nothing of it, just normal neighborly socializing between men who lived next to each other. About 9 months ago, Richard started hosting what he described as men's nights on Friday evenings, gatherings specifically for men from the neighborhood, no wives or girlfriends invited, supposedly just an opportunity for the guys to relax and socialize without family responsibilities. Kyle mentioned that Richard had invited him to join these gatherings, asked if I minded if he went. I didn't mind at all. Kyle worked hard, deserved time to relax with friends, and I appreciated having Friday evenings to myself occasionally for my own hobbies and downtime. Kyle started attending these men's nights regularly, leaving around 7 on Friday evenings and returning home around 11 or midnight. He never said much about what happened at these gatherings when he returned, would just say they'd watched sports and had drinks, that it was fun and relaxing, nothing particularly notable or interesting to report. I didn't press for details, assumed it was just the kind of casual socializing men do that isn't particularly interesting to describe or hear about, watching games, drinking beer, maybe playing cards, or discussing sports and work. It seemed harmless and normal, exactly what Richard had described. But after a few months of these regular Friday gatherings, I started noticing small changes in Kyle's behavior that seemed odd, but that I couldn't quite connect to anything specific. He became more protective of his phone, keeping it password protected and face down, taking it with him even when just going to another room. He seemed more secretive about his Friday night plans, would get slightly defensive if I asked casual questions about what they'd done at the men's night. He started doing his own laundry for the first time in our marriage, insisting he'd handle washing his own clothes rather than having them mixed with the household laundry I normally did. These changes individually seemed minor and potentially innocuous. Maybe Kyle just wanted more privacy with his phone. Maybe he felt self-conscious about me asking about the men's nights because nothing interesting happened and he didn't want to admit they were boring. Maybe he decided to be more helpful with household chores by doing his own laundry. But collectively, the changes created a sense that something had shifted, that Kyle was behaving differently in ways I couldn't quite explain or understand. The discovery that would begin to reveal what was actually happening came about 4 months after Kyle started attending the men's nights. I was putting away clean laundry one evening and noticed something unusual in Kyle's drawer. A pair of women's underwear, lacy and red, definitely not mine in style or size. They were tucked in the back of his sock drawer, partially hidden beneath his socks as if deliberately concealed rather than accidentally mixed in. I stood there holding these unfamiliar panties, my mind immediately jumping to the obvious explanation. Kyle was having an affair. These belonged to another woman. I'd discovered evidence of infidelity, but something about the scenario didn't quite fit that explanation. If Kyle was having an affair, why would he keep his mistress's underwear in our home, in his drawer where I might find them? That seemed unnecessarily risky and careless for someone conducting a secret relationship. I didn't confront Kyle immediately about the panties. Instead, I took a photo of them with my phone, documenting what I'd found, then replaced them exactly where I'd discovered them. I wanted to observe and gather more information before revealing what I knew, wanted to understand what was happening, rather than jumping to conclusions based on one piece of confusing evidence. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention to Kyle's patterns and behavior, particularly around the Friday men's nights. I noticed that Kyle would shower extensively before leaving for these gatherings, much more thoroughly than he normally showered, spending extra time on grooming and using cologne he didn't usually wear. He'd dress with unusual care for what was supposedly just casual drinks with neighbors, choosing specific clothes, checking his appearance multiple times, behaving more like someone preparing for a date than for casual male socializing. I also noticed changes in how Kyle behaved after returning from these Friday nights. He'd go immediately to shower again when he got home, washing thoroughly before interacting with me, as if removing evidence of wherever he'd been and whatever he'd done. His clothes from these evenings would disappear into his private laundry rather than the regular household laundry, processed separately so I wouldn't see them or handle them. These patterns suggested Kyle was doing something at these men's nights that he was actively trying to hide from me, something that required careful preparation beforehand and thorough cleaning afterward, something he didn't want me to discover through his clothing or his body. Combined with the women's underwear I'd found in his drawer, the pieces began suggesting possibilities I didn't want to consider. Was Kyle attending some kind of sex party disguised as men's night? Was Richard hosting gatherings that involved activities far beyond just watching sports and drinking beer? I decided to investigate more directly. One Friday evening, when Kyle was at Richard's house for the men's night, I walked over there under the pretense of borrowing something, planning to see if I could observe anything unusual or get a sense of what was actually happening. When I approached Richard's house, I immediately noticed all the curtains were closed and blinds drawn, the house completely sealed from external observation despite it being a warm evening when you'd normally have windows open. I could hear music and male voices inside, but nothing that sounded unusual or concerning from outside. I knocked on the door, and after a long delay, Richard answered, looking surprised and slightly uncomfortable to see me. I asked if I could borrow some sugar for baking, a mundane request that gave me reason to be there. Richard hesitated, said he wasn't sure if he had sugar, but he'd check, asked me to wait outside rather than inviting me in, as would normally be polite. Through the briefly opened door, I caught a glimpse of the interior. Several men, including Kyle, in the living room, though I couldn't see clearly what they were doing before Richard stepped into my sightline and blocked the view. Richard returned with sugar, handed it to me at the door, clearly eager for me to leave. As I walked back to my house, I felt certain something unusual was happening at these gatherings, something the participants didn't want wives to see or know about. The question was what exactly they were doing, and whether it was innocent but potentially embarrassing or something more concerning that actually constituted betrayal. I decided to hire a private investigator, explaining my suspicions about Kyle's Friday night activities and asking for professional surveillance and documentation. The investigator, a woman named Sandra Chen, said she'd seen various scenarios involving secret male gatherings, and that discovery usually revealed either gambling, sex parties, or occasionally something more unusual like cross-dressing or fetish activities that men were hiding from their partners. Sandra conducted surveillance over 3 Friday nights, documenting who attended these gatherings, taking photos through windows where possible, following participants when they left to see if they went elsewhere afterward. What she discovered was unexpected and strange. The men's nights were apparently poker parties, but with an unusual twist. The participants were playing strip poker, progressively removing clothing as they lost hands, with the twist being that they were wearing women's lingerie underneath their regular clothes, revealed as they stripped down during the game. Sandra had obtained photos through windows, images showing several men, including Kyle, in various states of undress, wearing bras and panties and other women's intimate apparel, playing cards and drinking while dressed in lingerie. The photos were clear enough to see that this wasn't a one-time joke, but a regular pattern. The men came prepared with women's clothing worn under their regular clothes, specifically for this purpose, as part of an ongoing activity at these weekly gatherings. The revelation was bizarre and difficult to process. Kyle wasn't having an affair. He was participating in some kind of cross-dressing poker night, regularly wearing women's underwear to these male gatherings, engaging in an activity he'd completely hidden from me despite its regularity and obvious importance to him. The women's panties I'd found in his drawer weren't evidence of infidelity, but were his own, purchased for wearing to these gatherings, hidden because he knew I'd ask questions if I discovered them. I sat with this information for several days, trying to understand what it meant and how I felt about it. Kyle wasn't cheating, wasn't betraying me sexually with another person, wasn't conducting an affair, but he was engaging in secret activities he'd deliberately concealed, was wearing women's clothing in contexts he'd never discussed with me, was participating in something significant enough to require elaborate preparation and concealment, but that he'd chosen not to share with his wife. I felt betrayed not by the cross-dressing itself. I could potentially have been supportive if Kyle had wanted to explore gender expression or clothing preferences, but by the systematic deception, the elaborate lies, the creation of this secret life he'd hidden behind the cover story of innocent men's nights. He'd spent 9 months attending these gatherings weekly, never once mentioning what they actually involved, allowing me to believe they were standard socializing when they were something completely different. I also felt disturbed by the group dynamic. This wasn't Kyle privately exploring something personal in the safety of our home with my knowledge and support. This was him joining a group activity organized by our neighbor, participating in something communal that multiple men were hiding from their wives, creating a culture of collective deception where none of the women were allowed to know what was actually happening on these Friday nights. I decided to confront Kyle with the evidence I'd gathered, rather than continuing to observe silently. I waited until we were home together on a Sunday afternoon, then told him I needed to talk about something serious. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos Sandra had taken, images of him and other men at Richard's house wearing women's lingerie while playing cards. "This is what's actually happening at the men's nights," I said calmly, watching Kyle's face go through shock, fear, and resignation as he saw the photos. "You've been wearing women's underwear to these gatherings for months, while telling me you're just watching sports and having drinks. You've been systematically lying to me about what you're doing every Friday night. So I need you to explain what this is actually about, and why you've been hiding it from me." Kyle's response was halting and defensive. He tried to minimize it first, saying it was just a game, just for fun, that it didn't mean anything serious. When I pointed out that you don't systematically hide something meaningless for 9 months, don't buy women's clothing and conceal it in your drawer, don't shower extensively before and after if it's truly insignificant, Kyle shifted to different explanation. He said that Richard had introduced the lingerie poker concept, had framed it as adventurous and transgressive, something exciting specifically because it was secret and hidden from wives. Kyle claimed he'd been curious, had attended once thinking it was a one-time thing, but had found the experience exciting enough to continue. He said the appeal was partly the clothing itself. He found wearing women's lingerie arousing in ways he didn't fully understand, but that it was also about the secrecy and the group dynamic, the shared experience of doing something forbidden with other men who understood. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Why spend 9 months lying about this instead of having a conversation about wanting to wear women's clothing or explore cross-dressing or whatever this is actually about? Kyle said he'd been afraid of my reaction, worried I'd judge him or be disgusted, concerned that it would change how I saw him. He said it felt safer to keep it secret, to have this separate space where he could explore without risk of rejection or ridicule. Instead, you chose to lie to me for 9 months, I said. You created an entire secret life, hid clothing in our home, systematically deceived me about what you were doing, allowed me to believe a completely false story about these gatherings. You didn't give me the chance to be supportive or understanding because you never gave me the truth. You just decided you'd rather deceive me than risk an uncomfortable conversation. The confrontation revealed that Kyle had been participating in this activity not just at Richard's gatherings, but occasionally on his own as well, sometimes wearing women's underwear beneath his regular clothes to work, finding the secret transgressive and exciting. He'd created an entire hidden dimension to his sexuality and self-expression that he'd deliberately excluded me from, making unilateral decisions about our relationship and about what he'd share with me versus what he'd conceal. I told Kyle I needed time to process this discovery and decide what I wanted to do about our marriage. The issue wasn't the cross-dressing itself. Gender expression and clothing preferences were things I could potentially support and accommodate. The issue was the systematic deception, the choice to lie repeatedly rather than have difficult conversations, the creation of secret activities hidden behind cover stories, the 9 months of allowing me to believe a complete fiction about how he spent his Friday evenings. Kyle moved out temporarily to stay with a friend, giving me space to think without his presence. During that separation, I learned more about the men's night gatherings from other neighborhood wives, who'd also started questioning what their husbands were actually doing at these events. It turned out several of us had noticed strange behaviors and changes in our husbands, had discovered evidence of deception, but hadn't connected the pieces until my discovery prompted conversations. The revelation caused significant disruption in our neighborhood. Multiple couples dealt with the aftermath of discovering their husbands had been participating in secret activities they'd concealed. Multiple relationships were strained or ended by the discovery of systematic lying. Richard, the neighbor who'd organized these gatherings, became somewhat socially isolated as the wives collectively blamed him for creating and facilitating this culture of deception. Kyle and I eventually attempted marriage counseling to address the betrayal of trust and to determine whether our relationship could recover. What emerged through therapy was that Kyle had long-standing interests in cross-dressing and gender expression that he'd felt ashamed of and had hidden throughout our relationship. The men's night gatherings had given him permission to explore those interests in a group setting that normalized them, but the secrecy had been built into the activity from the beginning. Richard had specifically framed these gatherings as something wives shouldn't know about, creating a culture where deception was part of the appeal. The counseling revealed fundamental communication problems in our marriage that had existed long before the lingerie poker nights. Kyle had never felt safe being fully honest with me about his desires or interests, had defaulted to hiding anything he thought I might judge or reject, had built patterns of concealment rather than vulnerability. I had to examine my own contributions to creating a relationship dynamic where Kyle felt he couldn't be honest, where he'd chosen deception as safer than transparency. Ultimately, Kyle and I decided to divorce. The deception had damaged trust too severely to repair, and the counseling revealed incompatibilities in how we thought about honesty and communication that seemed too fundamental to overcome. We'd been together 10 years, but had apparently never achieved the depth of honesty and vulnerability that healthy relationships require, had instead built a partnership on surface compatibility while hiding significant truths from each other. 9 months after discovering what the men's nights actually involved, I'm 35 and divorced, rebuilding my life as a single woman. The discovery was strange and unexpected. Not infidelity, but cross-dressing poker parties. Not sexual betrayal, but systematic deception about gender expression and secret activities. The strangeness of what Kyle had been hiding almost overshadowed the real issue, that he'd spent 9 months lying to me, had created an entire secret life, had chosen deception over difficult, honest conversations. What I learned through this experience was that sometimes the secrecy itself is the problem more than what's being kept secret. Kyle's interest in wearing women's clothing wasn't inherently relationship ending. Many couples navigate gender expression and cross-dressing with honesty and mutual support. But Kyle's choice to hide it, to lie about it systematically, to participate in a group culture that celebrated deceiving wives, those choices revealed character and values that were incompatible with the kind of marriage I wanted. I also learned to pay attention to small changes and inconsistencies, even when surface explanations seem plausible. Kyle's increased phone secrecy, his defensive responses about the men's nights, his suddenly doing his own laundry, each of these individually could be explained innocuously. But collectively they indicated something had changed, something was being hidden, something required investigation rather than blind trust. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 35 and divorced after discovering my husband had been secretly participating in cross-dressing poker parties at our neighbor's house for 9 months while telling me he was just watching sports with guys. The discovery came through small observations: women's panties in his drawer, excessive grooming before these gatherings, defensive secrecy about what happened. A private investigator revealed the truth, and confrontation exposed 9 months of systematic lying about activities Kyle had chosen to hide rather than discuss honestly. The betrayal wasn't the cross-dressing, but the deception, the choice to build a secret life rather than risk vulnerability with his wife. And that fundamental dishonesty ended our marriage more completely than the strange truth ever could have. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize that changes in the silence matter, please like and subscribe.